Welcome back. In the first 2 weeks of this course, we used the knowledge of river morphologists and river engineers to better understand what rivers want and do, and how they are impacted by engineering interventions. This week, we focus on governance and decision-making. With governance, we mean the process through which decisions are taken, which includes the whole set of political, institutional, and administrative rules and practices. The photo on the left is taken at the festive opening of one of the Room of the River projects, with in the middle the lady in black, the Minister of Infrastructure and Water Management, who was responsible for the program and financing it. On the schedule on the right, you see that the governance of a program like Room for the River in the Netherlands can also be very complicated. Each colored block represents an organizational entity on regional and national levels involved in the formal process of governing the Dutch Room for the River program. In this presentation, we present the way decision-making on a Room for the River program has unfolded in the Netherlands. This is far from a blueprint for other rivers and countries. Every country and river needs a specifically designed and fitting arrangement. We therefore just take you through the context and the tradition in Dutch water governance, and the steps taken in decision-making for the Dutch Room for the River cases. Our core message of today: use the governance tradition and institutions of your own country and let time do its work. To understand the decision-making process that took place, we need to look back in time. Room for the River marks a shift from engineering approaches to river management to a Room for the River approach. To understand this, we need to start with a brief history of the Dutch water and then look at the changes in thinking that took place. We then continue with the institutional setting of water management and spatial planning in the Netherlands. Next, we focus on the formal process of policy development and decision-making until the so-called planologische kernbeslissing, the planning core decision that represents the formal decision by the minister and government. This is a crucial decision that gives green light to the start of the Room for the River program, and it also made the financial resources for its implementation available. We then conclude with discussing some of the remarkable aspects of this government arrangement. Aspects that are new, innovative for the Dutch context, and that emerged in the specific context of the Room for the River program. Let's start with a bit of myth-busting. Maybe you have heard stories that the whole of the Netherlands is located below sea level. Well, it's not that extreme, to be honest. But it's true that half of the country is prone to flooding, either from the sea or from the major rivers. The Dutch Room for the River program focuses on the 1/3 of the Netherlands that is at risk of flooding from rivers alone, so not from the sea. And another story about the Dutch and water states that God created the earth, but the Dutch made the Netherlands. This is actually about reclaiming land from the sea. Land reclamation started already in the 17th century, but it really took off in 1700, spurred by water safety issues and private investors that earned their money in the trade with the countries that later were occupied as Dutch colonies. You see these in purple on the map to the right. After 1900, reclamation became a governmental program, resulting in the reclamation of the Zuiderzeepolders, the southern sea polders. These you see in yellow on the map. The famine at the end of the Second World War was a major incentive of these governmental reclamation programs. No more hunger, which was to be achieved by more agricultural production. So, life as we know it in the Netherlands would be impossible without flood protection, like dikes, storm surge barriers, and other measures. There actually are about 18,000 kilometers of sea dikes, dunes, and river dikes. That's a lot. To compare, the total length of highways in the country is only 5,500 kilometers. And all these dikes need proper governance and management. The story of the Dutch and water might look like a success story, but it's actually a story of learning by doing, and ups and downs. the Downs are a history of smaller and bigger flood disasters. They have been formative for the Dutch culture and tradition in water governance. Our history of floods, with the biggest in 1421, 1960 and 1953, and numerous smaller disasters in between. In the 1990s, river floodings, a disaster was prevented, but it was a close call. This near-flood disaster of 1995 was one of the major triggers for the Room for the River program. This event actually coincided with a change in thinking, a changing perspective on the ecology of the river landscape and the space that rivers need. As such, this near-flooding disaster actually fell into a fertile soil. The relation with water and a history of learning by doing and flood disasters shaped the organization and institutional embedding of water governance in the Dutch governmental system. The deeply embedded solidarity when it comes to flood risk is still alive, and it also played its role in the Room for the River program. For example, citizens in the village of Lent that were forced to sell and leave their houses for the Nijmegen Room for the River project stated that this was difficult for them, but that they felt to have contributed to flood safety for all. The accompanying tradition of land reclamation required large areas of new land to be planned and transformed into productive landscapes, and in addition, induced the development of a strong spatial planning. So, what does this institutional setting look like, and who is doing what? Well, the most characteristic of the Dutch water management institutions are the water board, independent public institutions with a history of centuries, and an independent income of tax revenues from the landowners and residents in their region. Note that this thus includes all the private house owners as well. The water boards are embedded in a complex division of tasks between the national government and local governments with respect to water management. Rijkswaterstaat, an organization similar to the Departments of Public Works in many other countries, acts as the managing organization for channels and rivers on a national level, similar to the task of water boards on the regional level. For the Room of the River program, the specific division between tasks and responsibilities between the water boards and Rijkswaterstaat is extremely relevant. Rijkswaterstaat is responsible for the river, the floodplain between the dikes, navigation, water quality, dredging, etc., while the water boards are responsible for dike maintenance and construction. However, when major investments in dikes are required, for example because of national adjustment of flood safety standards, water boards will demand additional financial resources from the national government. You can imagine that this complicated division of responsibilities complicates a Room for the River program, where investments do not only concern dikes, but also spatial measures that give more room to the river. The tasks of municipalities, who are responsible for land use planning, further complicate things. Now, for the rest of this story, please keep in mind that there are two ways to deal with such complexity. First, and seemingly attractive, way is to try to simplify things, while another way is to embrace it and just deal with it. In between the national government and the water boards and municipalities is the province playing a coordinating role.